Graham, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for joining me in another episode of Kickoff Sessions. Firstly, it's a pleasure to record with someone with a proper mic and a proper equipment. When you're doing a lot of audio recordings, I've came across some awful audio over the last couple of months. So so I'd just say, I guess that's a good little start, But following a lot of stuff online, all around podcasting, you've so much experience in that area, and I think it's going to be great just to get your feedback on the landscape at the moment, as well as the things you've learned from podcasting, whether it's storytelling, whether it's in your own career, and should be awesome.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Darren. I really appreciate this and looking forward to our chat.
Awesome. So before we get going, do you want to give us a short background of yourself and what you get up to really, and how you're an expert of the day?
Sure. What I get up to. I'm a storyteller, Darren. So what I do is I tell stories. I help brands tell stories. I've been telling stories in different formats for many years. Its most recent incarnation as a podcast agency in two ways, really, helping brands tell human, authentic stories, and then also helping business leaders get onto and guest on people's podcasts to tell their stories. So it's all about storytelling, and we all love stories, right?
And where did that kind of come from in the origin? So a lot of people would be good naturally at communicating, conveying a story, but really how have you had so much experience now in podcasting, over years, between your own show, between the agency? What's kept you so interested in this market?
Well, I've always been fascinated in communication, and my first job out of university was teaching English in Japan in the mid-90s. Nice. And to do that, to survive, you have to be good at communication, not just speaking, but listening and communicating in different difficult environments, learning different cultures, understanding as well that your worldview is not the only one, that people see things differently. If you go and live in a different country, the first thing you realize is actually everything you've ever learned really is not necessarily so.
Yeah.
And that's a story that we all learn, isn't it? From where we grow up, what it means to be Irish or to be British or to be Japanese, all these things we inherit and think are the truth. When you go somewhere else, you realize actually it's not all necessarily correct.
And
so I've always been fascinated by that. Yeah.
Just different cultures and traveling,
really, Well, that's really being a traveler is being a storyteller as well, seeing how people, you meet humans. I say humans because we are very similar in that respect on the road, right? And you interact with them, you learn their stories, where they're from, you find out people are very similar under the surface, the superficial layer of how we look and the color of our skin and so on. So I've been, I think if you're fascinated by humans, travel, culture, communication, then you are by default somehow a storyteller. That's in us. And, that's been implanted in us from a very early age, from the first stories we heard in the crib all the way to selling iPhones, right? It's all storytelling.
Yeah, exactly. Whether it's marketing or whether you're in a hostel, because it's funny enough, a lot of the traveling I would have done as well, Southeast Asia, would have been that storytelling kind of vibe, going into a hostel, right, meeting people. It's your pitch. It's, it's your going out kind of face, if you're just drinking with mates. And funnily enough, a lot of that transferred over then into my career. If I was presenting in work, just being able to convey a story, it's difficult. It's like a muscle, being able to develop it, But podcasting is a number one great way to be able to learn how to speak really well, because there's nothing worse than listening back to your own audio and seeing the cracks in your own behavior, And I've seen that firsthand. My first 20 episodes, I was kind of shaky, finding my feet, still not there, But how have you been really developing, say, your storytelling, and how would you advise this towards brands or individuals? What are some of the steps that you'd go about doing?
Yeah, I like this riff because I look at podcasting or storytelling in general like stand-up comedy. I'm not a stand-up comedian, and I'm very much I'm in awe of stand-up comedians who can go on stage and be very vulnerable and somehow freestyle, make people laugh. If you look at how stand-up comedians do their craft, they'll go out and they'll practice their material, and they'll go to dive bars where, you've got three people in the front row and drunk, nobody else there. And they'll practice their material and it will bomb, or people will laugh, or they get hecklers. And they're very vulnerable. They face the moment of truth. They're out there putting their material out there, that's the cringe factor that you talk about when you listen back to yourself. And you're constantly, almost in a very agile way, like you would develop software. You're building something small, very agile, validate it, get the feedback and the data and dump it, tinker with it, or double down on it. Same way you would build an app, right? Very agile. And that's how you should think about your story. A lot of people look at storytelling, oh, I've got to write a book. And then once the book's published, I'm out there telling my story. You don't need a finished book to have a story worth telling. What you should do is, instead of that, find your why stuff. Like, oh, I've got to have this story inside of me. Find your start. Yeah. Look at all good apps. You know, you're a software engineer. You know that day one in app development is very different from day 100, etc. And that's how it builds. And the same with your story. Get out. You got to get out there. You got to get on stage. The equivalence of that is get on the mic, get on stage, make yourself vulnerable, face humiliation. You don't die. Face the cringe, get through that, and then you get better.
Yeah. And what's awesome with that as well is that it could be like audio format, or it could even be writing. I think if you're writing like LinkedIn captions, you know, trying to pull in audiences, or it could be even Instagram or whatever, there is that element of like, you just need to kind of go through those shit moments. And I think nailing them down, especially for me, which was first in audio based, was so difficult, but it is super transferable then. And like, I think the comedy is a good example, because like you see people that have like this crisp, clean storytelling at the end, but like when they got to that stage, it was a lot of trial and error, you know,
rejection.
Like, well, exactly. that's the main focus. But it really is the sticking in there. And you mentioned something really cool there about how you just kind of start, you just kind of get up and going. A lot of people that are my generation, like 24, 25, 26, think they're not like experienced enough to try something. Could be a business podcast, it could be whatever. And then they kind of put on the long finger. But what I've learned is I just started recording. I just started writing LinkedIn posts. And even though I'm not this hedge fund manager of a firm that's managing 200 million in a fund, I'm still just learning my own ability and kind of passing off that knowledge. I think that's what's so interesting, is like, you don't need to be an expert. You just need to know how to craft stories, tell the downsides, tell the upsides, and then try to convey it in a clear message.
Well, look at two examples recently. Let's take, for example, Greta Thunberg versus President Trump. You know, you've got a 19-year-old taking on the president of the United States and winning, right? So think about that. You know, she was no expert on climate change, but she had the world's attention. And you said you don't need to be an expert. You're absolutely right. You just need to care enough. And if you have people's attention, that's all you need. And then look recently in the world of podcasting, Harry Stebbings from 20 Minute VC, he raised 140 million fund. I'm not sure the exact numbers.
140. Yeah.
How old is this guy? He's 24, 25.
He started when he was like 17 podcasting, I think.
Right. He dropped out of school. He started doing podcasts like you, talking to, you know, it could be CEOs of startups, talking to limited partners of funds, and raised 100x million. You know, it was a huge raise.
Yeah.
That's bigger than most established VCs have as funds. And what was his expertise? Nothing. He just had a lot of experience,
you know, doing, as in, he recorded 2,400 episodes or something. So he just had to learn so much with the market, you know?
Yeah, that's what matters. So, you know, to your friends, to your peers, look at that. There's no excuse. The only difference between, you know, me and you know, quite obviously the years, is that, you know, I think with your generation as well, maybe they look at my generation and say, well, they have that expertise and therefore they are credible to stand up and do it. But that's the imposter syndrome that we all have, that, oh, I don't belong. But look at these guys, you know, they're up there on stage, they belong. So we can all do it.
And that's what I thought was so interesting, was like, because for Harry Stebbings, when he has 2,400 episodes, what I was thinking in my head was, what was his growth like? What does his chart look like of his overall engagement? Because for me, you know, it's just the ebb and flow of life. It goes up and goes down. But I think once you have like a clear mission of like why you're doing it, similar with anything, it's like, why are you going to the gym? Why are you working here? Once you kind of know why you're doing it, then it kind of is worth sticking around for. So when I saw like that amount of episodes, which I don't know if that's the correct number, but I was like, it's just crazy.
Right, yeah.
But I was like, it's just crazy to be stuck in it. So that's obviously where like the kind of passion and interest comes from, you know, and
Yeah.
like, again, you know, kind of what's your kind of thoughts even on that? Because if people are picking a podcast or picking a side project, you got to think about like long term. Funnily enough, I saw a post yesterday. You may know a guy called Jonathan Tesser. Tesser is his name. He's a LinkedIn guy. And guy has like 125,000 followers or whatever. And he put up a post saying, you know, was it hard work and like diligence that got me to like this kind of following and whatnot? And he said there was an element of that, but he's also said it's an element of luck. He got very lucky. He had one post that had 25,000 reactions and 1 million views. And he said that, you know, unless you kind of get those strokes of luck after a while, it's very easy to see why people give up, you know. And that's kind of my point, is about how would you advise people to kind of pick something that is quite long term? Because, you know, you see 2,400 episodes, you want to see the success in something, you got to be in there for the long run. So what would your advice be around something like that?
Yeah, it's a big issue, isn't it? Because people give up around about, there's the first Valley of Death, which is about 6 episodes, which is, actually I'm bored of this now because it's not as fun at the beginning. Now I've got an inbox of lots of episodes and I really can't be bothered to edit them. That's the first Valley of Death. And then from there on inwards, it's a graft, keeping it going. If you look at Harry Stebbings, obviously 2,400 in, he's got a very strong reason to do this. Either he really doesn't care, or he understands what it's doing for him and he's committing to the long term. It's an investment, isn't it? That there is a difference. You look back at that classic marshmallow test where they put kids in a room and they would say to them, videoing them, you know, you can have 1 marshmallow now, or if I go out the room and come back in 30 minutes, you can have 2 marshmallows. And then they video these kids, don't they? And they watch them sort of struggle. It's really cute. These kids like looking at the marshmallow, like, I'm going to have it. I'm going to have it. And then, you know, like the kid eats it. He caves in. I got to have the marshmallow now. And then, you know, there's the one that waits 30 minutes and he gets his 2 marshmallows. And that very simple deferment of gratification is a very strong indicator to success long term. And in some ways you can't train it. It's in you. So you have it. So you've committed to 50 episodes and you understand the value of investment. And it really is that, an investment in yourself. If somebody's that 1 marshmallow guy, you can't get that guy to commit to 50, right? Because no matter what you do, you're just really just trying to gamify it to keep his interest in it long enough to keep going. But that will never keep going if you take away all those kind of gimmicks. It will fall apart. It's the same with investment, isn't it? You understand the value of compound interest. You understand the value of putting X% of your money away and squirreling it away for the future. But some people don't. And it's the same with podcasting, is that you can't teach that. All you can teach is the fact you can draw a line between investment and your personal brand long term and say that is a valid investment. And people say, oh, I get it. Yeah, I understand investment, and I understand that if I do 50, I might not get immediate payback. But look at Harry Stebbings.
Yeah.
You know, I might get a bit of that if I continue.
If you continue.
And that's the game that we have to play.
But what's awesome as well about that is like, well, there's 2 sides to it. You know, one, you're saying about the gratification. People need validation from time to time. And we all do, you know, like I need my girlfriend to pat me on the back every once in a while because I just need it from, you know, and this is just the cycle of life.
We're human, right?
But podcasting is such a grind in particular because you don't get the same reaction that you may do from an Instagram post. You know, like Instagram has now been driven towards just ass and abs. Like that's literally like how it's kind of built, and people that have those profiles get that instant gratification. But because podcasting is long form, your audience dips in and out. So that's why it's like, okay, are you committed to it? Do you think do you see a lot of value in this long term? And then it's slow and progressive from there, you know?
When you look at Instagram, it's very seductive, like you say, ass and abs and luxury jets. You know, people are flying in these private jets, and it's amazing how many people have got private jets now. You can there's a company in Russia where you can go and sit on the runway in a private jet, and they'll give, I think it's like $200 for an hour, and they'll sit in there and take photos, and then you go. It doesn't get off the ground. In fact, it doesn't have any wings. It's just the actual cabin of the private jet, looking like a private jet. That's the point. That's what Instagram is. And it's very seductive. If you don't have that internal center, which is, I understand that everything I see here isn't what it is, right? That a lot of what Instagram claims to be the truth is actually fake. Very few people are living those lifestyles. Even, you know, look at the abs. You look at it 6 hours later when they've eaten a McDonald's or drunk a bottle of Coke, or, you know, or taking it from a different angle.
See them in the gym, you know, how many guys have you seen in the gym that just look completely different than what they are in Instagram? And
Absolutely.
same with girls, you know, it's just like the reality of life. But that's such a deeper, like, psychological, like, issue in terms of, we need it to always be the best on the front, whereas, like, behind closed doors, you know, it could be completely different. And I think that's where you go back to your authentic point. Like you're saying, you're pushing this into brands. Like, podcasting is raw, it's audio, there's sometimes video, but ultimately you have to be interested in this. Otherwise it's going to be evident. And funny enough, you may know Pat Flynn from Smart Passive Income.
Of course, yeah.
He's the guy that I actually followed religiously to get up and going. And he was saying that, like, if you pick a category that's not aligned to what you want versus what you think someone else wants, he was like, it will become evident and people will see the lack of authenticity with that. And again, it will just begin to decline. So these are the variables, and it's very transferable to just all aspects of life, you know. There's a big thing about, like, you know, being seen to be doing something versus actually wanting to do it long term. And that's just it's kind of mechanics.
Absolutely.
Of just, interest.
You know, that's just confidence though, Darren. And as you get older like me, and you really don't give a shit about what people think about you. That's the beauty of getting old. Of course, I would love to be your age and healthy and have my full head of hair, et cetera, et cetera. But the payoff is that I just stopped caring so much. Yeah. And when you're younger, it's hard, isn't it? You graduate university, and then around you, all your peers, and they think, oh, he's got a car now, and he's a VP, and look at me, I'm just starting out. And that's the challenge, isn't it? We very much benchmark ourselves against other people. And therefore, we are seduced by their stories and what they portray on the media. And yet, we have to commit to the long term. We have to understand, like, I mean, the great thing about people like Pat Flynn and Harry Stebbings is they give us hope. These are people that have done differently. You know, if they did like the abs and the other lot, right? That lot. Yeah, if they did like abs and ass lot, they would have been like that. So we have to be very clear about who we listen to and who we follow, and understand, actually, you know, I find that success in life, generally career, is less about saying yes to a lot of things, and it's more about understanding what to say no to. And once you understand that actually that's not me, I'm not going to do that, and I'm not of that world, then you can really, like you say, pick the category that you want to do and be true to yourself in everything. And yeah, maybe, okay, I'll give up, I'll sacrifice a little bit here. I'll accept that, you know, this guy's got a better car than me. In fact, I don't have a car, and I'm willing not to have a car. He's going to lord it around in his nice new Beamer, but I'm not going to do that. And understand that that's the payoff now, because I know in years to come that I will, as a result of that payoff, I will have more freedom to do what I want. And as you get older, that's what matters. Freedom, not money.
Yeah, because it's so interesting, because, like, at my age, everything's so easily influenced. Even starting a podcast, even doing something like this, people will follow trends. Starting a company just because they want to follow the trend. And the perfect example is a graduate program. So I would have done something similar. I would have followed what I thought, what I would have liked, followed the crowd essentially, and then ultimately I had to reverse engineer it and go off into something that I was actually more interested in. And that took a bit of an evolutionary kind of process, you know, and it was very, very difficult at that time to make that critical decision, because it was like, okay, I made a mistake.
What were you going to do?
My idea was, I was in straight consulting, and I thought that's what I kind of wanted to do, but I was definitely more interested in finance, and it got pretty extreme. So I thought I would have had to transition, go back to university to do a master's in finance. And I was really trying to, like, suss out different options. I applied towards King's College in London. I applied for a scholarship in UCD in Dublin. And then ultimately my role in Revolut actually came through at that point. They actually reached out, and it just happened, which is a stroke of luck. But it was interesting because, that's the period of when you leave university where people have that kind of like gap. from, I'm going to fuck this up, but if you know Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning,
Mm-hmm.
there's still there's an element in his book where he talks about the existential vacuum, which is where people have this kind of gap and they don't know how to fill it because they have no like purpose. And that's exactly what it was. So it doesn't matter if it's podcasting or your career or your life, it's that like vacuum of, I thought I wanted something because I was following someone else's plan. And like, we all wear the same clothes. We're all influenced by others, but figuring that out is tough, man. You know, it's a tough process.
But that's what you're doing now, right? You're, by having a podcast, not only are you talking to other people, you're figuring it out. And I think that's something that your listeners should reflect on, right? That I haven't figured it out yet, Darren. And I'm nearly 50, right?
Well,
and that's the point.
You look a lot younger than 50. You look about 35, 40, man.
Well, there you go. So the filters on these things are amazing. The point is that, you know, as you get older, you have a lot of, if you look at your life, there's just lots of chapters in a book, right? Don't make sense. You know, I studied artificial intelligence at university. I went and taught English in Japan. I started a mobile communications company. Like, what the hell is that all about? And now I'm a podcaster. All these, and there was a period where I sold a business and traveled the world for 4 years, right? It just, it's kind of random stuff. And at the time, you have these existential crises, which are, what the hell am I doing with my life? If I at 21 had got onto the graduate scheme at McKinsey, et cetera, I would be a partner by now. But look at me, I'm like pissing around with my life on a beach in Fiji and wondering, like, how do I get Wi-Fi? And that's the challenge, isn't it? Is that it doesn't make sense. And when you look at other people, it's like, that guy's got it worked it out. He's like had the plan since day one. His parents got him into that school and into that company and and it just followed through. And then we're in this situation. We've got lots of, if you choose the road less traveled, as they say, right? That you have this challenge, which it doesn't make sense. It's not carved out for you. So the purpose of doing a podcast in many ways is to make sense of it, because it's joining the dots. It's by talking it through, by jamming literally on these subjects with other people. You're thinking, actually, that thought in your head forms a neural connection with another experience and it starts to come together. The more you do that, the more you talk about it, the more you talk your story, reflect on it, which you're doing, making sense of it, the more the dots come together. And then as you get that experience, you look back on it and think, actually, that's the story I'm telling here, right? But you don't know that story unless you start the process of telling it, ironically, right? So I put it out to everybody there, like, podcast for that reason. And that reason is a good enough reason. Forget about, oh yeah, this is great for meeting people and leads and et cetera. That's all great. But do it for that reason, like telling your story in your terms.
And what's so cool about that is, like, you define a lot of those stuff for yourself. Like, obviously it was evolutionary, but when you do a personal project, what's so interesting is that you have to figure out all this shit, and like, be as blunt as it is, like 2 weeks ago, I was like looking at my backlog, thinking like, am I going to be able to figure things out? And you could solve all these micro problems. And that's what it is. It's solving all these issues, problems with video, problems with audio. But when you're working with a big company, it's often you can go week to week and just become more institutionalized. You don't have these real like hard learnings, and you learn so much other stuff, and no doubt about that. And where I'm working is like awesome and I love it, but it's not to say that you don't do all this other stuff where you have to figure them out yourself. And it's almost like entrepreneurial, like, because like obviously it's low risk. There's no doubt about that, but there is that kind of entrepreneurship kind of element of it, which is cool because there's a lot of opportunities from podcasting to build from there, and to move on to, like you said, with an agency, you had so much experience with it and moved on to something like that. So actually, yeah, what's your even thoughts on that, turning podcasting into like a career and making that kind of evolutionary? Because for you, it was very much like step up over the last couple of years because it became so natural after a while.
Well, to be honest, my step into podcasting wasn't that natural as a business. In 2017, so basically going back a little bit, 2012, I sold a telecoms business, and we'd grown it for 13 years. It was a research business, and we researched how people communicated, and it was consumer research, not sort of clipboard stuff, but like looking at behaviors and so on and looking at trends. And 2012, I sold out and hadn't had a day off for 12, 13 years. So I said to my wife, look, I really don't want to start another business, which a lot of people do at the time.
Yeah.
And I said, well, let's just go and travel. My son was 6 at the time. So our plan was let's just travel. We don't know what we're going to do. We sold all our stuff, 3 suitcases left. That was it. We flew to New Zealand, the other side of the world, and landed in New Zealand. And then the adventure started. We had a one-way ticket to New Zealand, and we traveled for 4 years. Now, at the end of that, I got kind of bored of lying on tropical beaches, which is like really ironic because you look at Instagram, going back to that again, I think, living the dream, hashtag living the dream, living my best life. But actually, if you're an entrepreneur, like lying on a tropical beach gets pretty boring.
Yeah, because your mind is so fucking active, man, and you're just like wanting to solve things and message people and just sort things out.
Do stuff, create things, challenge. Like that resistance that really makes you as an entrepreneur. So about 2017, I started a podcast in Asia to talk to tech entrepreneurs. It's called Asia Tech Podcast. End of 2017, and then by 2018, there was so much interest in it that I had this thought in the back of my head, actually, I could start a business out of this. And then I was living in Japan at the time. We moved to Singapore, and then I started a business. And so it's like, it's this gravity, it pulls you back. That is the DNA of an entrepreneur, is that you gravitate back towards what you're about. And lying on tropical beaches is fun, but it's not what I'm about. And what I'm about is people and challenge and making stuff. And that's why I started a podcast business, because for me, that makes me happy. That makes me more happy than, these hashtag beautiful sunset or whatever. I can do that, but that's not what it's about. And you once you've got, going back to the Instagram thing, is you think that's what makes you happy. Mm-hmm. You think that is success. For ultimately, success is a story you can write yourself, right? And what makes, I think people happy is really what you should define as success.
And there's a lot of routine as well built into that, because you enjoy, working out, going, meeting people, meeting clients and whatnot. But if you're just sitting on a beach, like, you lose that routine, which you're so used to doing. So it's probably like almost like building that in, like finding ways to build in like a proper routine, because if you are that way inclined, there's only so much fucking beaches you can sit on without going insane, it takes a bit of time like that. But
you drive people insane.
Exactly. There's just different elements of your life at different points, which is what's interesting. So like, you're running this podcast business now, and you've had your own one, you've had this this kind of branded one, and there's a lot of changes coming down the road with podcasting, which is awesome. I think the last couple of years has been great. Even like Spotify, the buyout of like Caller Daddy and things like this recently. It's just like changing times, which is awesome. How do you see about the future of podcasting right now? What's your opinion on it? Do you see kind of a bright future? Obviously, there's two sides of every argument, and people say that it's overcrowded and it's too saturated. You can't monetize it. Doesn't like 1% of people getting monetization. Or just what's your general approach for the next 24 months?
I'm quite bullish on it. I have to be. I've been in this long enough to hear all the bullshit about, I don't have 5 minutes to listen to a podcast. That's what it was like back then. So look at the numbers now, Darren. Like, we got 2.7 million podcasts in the world, which is the latest data. And what people say, but everybody has a podcast now. I say, okay, let's go back a little bit, shall we? 1998, there were 2.7 million websites in the world. And today there are 1.8 billion. Now, if you look at the analogy between the two, is that the websites came along. We created websites, and my first ever business was a website design business, to create a better, more effective interface between a business and customers, right? So it was easier to look at the website than it was to go to the store or to phone the store up or to send a letter to the company. So it was all about a more effective interface. And what I feel is that podcasts play a similar role, but whereas websites do that for businesses, podcasts do that for business leaders. So they're more effective interfaces for individuals to talk to customers, to talk to markets, to talk to partners. And so if you look at brands today, one brand, but how many leaders, Revolut may have 100 in there. A McKinsey may have thousands. So the way I see it is like, we're not going to have one brand, one podcast. And so 2.7 million is nothing. The future will have one person, one podcast. So if I want to listen and find out about you, if I'm recruiting you for my business, probably the first thing I do is go listen to your podcast. And think, what is this guy about? What does he care about? Who does he know? What is his ideas? So think about that the opportunity for growth is massive. And so now if you look at from 2.7 to 1.8 billion, that's a 1,000 times growth approximately.
It's crazy.
That's where we're still yet to go.
And what's so cool about that is I was reading the Buzzsprout statistics from December 2020. And at that stage, I think it was like 1.9 million. And they said that, I actually have a post about this, but I'm going to fuck this up. But basically, the amount of podcasts that get to 10 episodes, the amount of podcasts that get to 50 episodes and to 100, it was like if you posted consistently for, I think it was like 8 weeks or it was like 16 weeks, it puts you in like top 25% because there's so many of these inactive podcasts which lie just dying on the internet, which is so interesting because that 2.3 million is actually, when you get underneath the hood, a lot of these aren't so developed.
Yeah.
So what's so interesting is, take for instance, you pick a super niche category. Obviously mine is like business and careers, so it is a category, but it's not super niche. But let's say for instance, if it was like semiconductors, you had a semiconductors podcast and you talk to people who manufacture them, who created them, who sold them, you could get to the top of that market pretty quickly, because how many of other people are in this niche area? Next thing you know, you could build a business around it. You have a semiconductor business, you have people out marketing. This is just an example now, but what I'm trying to say is that the more you niche down, you get into these realms of untouched territory, and that's a simple way to put it, is it's untouched at the moment for certain, obviously, areas.
Well, think about also the value of that market. Let's say you're doing your semiconductor podcast. It's very niche. So if you had, for example, 300 listeners per episode, think of the value of that, because 300 is nothing really, but as a narrow cast entity, 300 people interested in semiconductors. Who's interested in semiconductors? The only people who are interested in the people who work in that industry. Now, would people question going to a conference and speaking to 100 people in your industry? People do it all the time. We used to do it all the time. And yet here's an opportunity not just to speak to 300, 3 times that, but to speak to them for the next 10 years. And that is the untapped power of a podcast. In investing, you mentioned Pat Flynn, passive income is what it's about, right? Think about that in the context of communications. Now somebody can be listening to Graham and Darren talking, and Darren could be asleep, I could be in a meeting, but they're still sitting with us having that conversation. That's the nearest we can get to cloning out there. In 5 years' time, I can discover a semiconductor podcast that somebody did, right? I think, wow, this guy's interesting. Go and check him out. Now compare that to your average LinkedIn tweet, which dies in 24 hours, right?
Exactly.
So 300 people sounds very small. Compare it to an Instagram post, compare it to YouTube. That is extremely targeted, and it lasts a very, very long time. Now, if you were to do 50 episodes, think about that, the power of that.
And the leads.
You've got to have a very long time mindset for that.
Exactly.
That's what people get.
But they come, again, it's listeners, you've 300 people. Those people work for companies, they can work for semiconductor companies, and that's where the value and principle comes from. But you touched a great point there about, audience and the numbers. So the example that I heard about this was someone who actually had the number 300 was saying that they're going to crash their podcast because they're only getting 300 downloads an episode. And the counter argument is, imagine if you had 300 people in a room listening to you every single week. As in, if you went in to do a presentation on a Wednesday, every Wednesday, that would be huge, So because these are long form compared to YouTube, which has an average engagement of like 3 minutes, that my average podcast will have maybe half, 50% all listened to, which is crazy. Like the level of engagement like that, and how audiences can be kept, you know, which is just awesome. So it's a cool vertical to look at. But what we touched on before we started recording was around the engagement element of podcasting, which I was always really disappointed about. And I used to shit on Spotify quite a lot because I felt like that, you know, they didn't open up their doors to comments and community because they were too afraid of what happened to YouTube. So what they have done now, obviously, is Greenrooms, which is the Clubhouse version of Spotify. Essentially, that's what they're going to do. Now, Clubhouse was awesome when it kicked off, but it had its problems, but it had its disadvantage. It had advantages, which was you were able to engage with these people, build an audience, and have more of an interactive basis. It's like a virtual event. Then the disadvantages of that was there was obviously a lot of shit rooms. There was obviously a lot of bullshit talk. But I think Spotify may resolve a lot of these problems, and I think that's up to the kind of creators. So they're really looking for podcasters to step up in this place to either, you know, MC an event or to start building this. So what's your thoughts on something like that now coming around the future in terms of audiences and engagement?
There's a lot in there.
Sorry.
Unpacking it a little bit. Let's talk about engagement now. For example, let's talk about music as an example and how we've really learned about engagement. Nobody ever complained that you couldn't comment or like on a song, right? But look at how engaged people are with songs. Now, here's the interesting thing is that before I talk about Spotify Greenrooms, you were talking about people interacting with podcasts, and we look at 300 people and we look at how people interact or can't interact with podcasts. So here I was a few years ago, I was walking across a crossroads in Fukuoka, Japan, which is on the island of Kyushu. I never lived there, but I was visiting there. Never been there before, walking across the road. And halfway across the road, somebody grabbed me by the arm. And it's very strange in Japan for that to happen, for people to touch you. And somebody pulled me and he said, you're that guy. You're Graham Brown, the podcast guy. They're just standing in the middle of the road. I'm like, what the hell? And he knew who I was. And then he pulled me aside and started talking to me. You know, I was miles from home, just at the middle of this random place. And he started talking to me. He said, I didn't know who he was. He goes, I've been following your podcast since you began. And he started telling me everything. Like, he knew where I was from. He knew I was from London. He knew I had, at the time, a 12-year-old kid. And all of this, right? And I was blown away. And I was like, that really made me think. And I think to all your listeners and to yourself and to anybody else looking at engagement numbers, there are a lot more people in orbit around a podcast than actually listen to it. So for every one listener, there's like 100 people in orbit around a podcast who occasionally listen or are aware of it. And we discredit that, and we tend to underestimate that because we only see the people clicking. And you'll be really, really surprised. And we don't live in a world of events right now. But the next time you go to a conference about your subject, I can guarantee somebody's going to walk up to you and go, oh yeah, Darren, I listened to your podcast. And you're like, whoa. And that happens a lot. Now, that's the point about engagement. Now, let's talk about Spotify and Greenroom. The big thing here is that the real push for Spotify is not about creating a new Clubhouse. The real push for Spotify is it wants a piece of searchable audio that if you think about social media, for example, and advertising revenues, Facebook obviously is the biggest entity here. But the thing is that social media is only 4% of our day. That's the amount of time we spend on it. Some people more, some people less, obviously. But we spend 40% of our day in conversation, 10 times more. So the amount of data we're transferring between people, which is very indicative of what we like, who we know, what we care about, what we're going to have for dinner, all that stuff. 10 times what exists in social media. So if you look at the long-term outlook, Spotify will become the Google of sound. That's the way it's going. And this for them is one way of capturing all of that conversation that nobody's currently indexing searchable audio. And it's a great Clubhouse clone, but that's the long-term goal, which people don't see. And that's where we're heading with audio. And of course, they will encourage us to get onto these platforms to capture our conversations rather than just, Zoom calls or traditional phones or face-to-face. Because if they can do that, then they can have a piece of the action in advertising and build a better data profile of us. That's where we're heading with this.
That's so interesting, especially the Google point. I think that's really, really cool because people don't really see it coming. Like, you're so close to the ground with this stuff that, like, you have your ear to the ground with this and you're seeing their longevity play, versus I would have even thought that it was more like a counter argument towards Clubhouse to pull people in, but do you think that will promote a lot of that engagement and really like improve the connection between people who are listening? So maybe it could be a little bit down the road. Like, I remember Clubhouse were doing considerations around monetizing for people that were recording rooms. So let me give you a perfect example. Tim Dillon, the comedian, he would have had rooms that were filled, 7,500 people like that straight away. And they were looking at ways to essentially host an event. So he could do a stand-up event on Clubhouse, or you could be someone like Lex Friedman who'd come on and do an AI talk, and he could charge 99 cents a seat. So when I heard that with Clubhouse, and I don't know how far that's gone, but that was their view. That was definitely their view initially when I actually listened to their CEO speaking that, which I thought was just awesome at the time. Do you think something like this now would be built in and
Twitter's
be
there,
offering
right? Yeah.
something like that?
Yeah. Them and Twitter are up against each other on that, the live event thing. That's one monetization route. I think it makes complete sense. I think you've got to look at Clubhouse and social audio and Spotify Greenroom and Twitter Spaces and all that stuff in the context of what I would say is how music used to relate to radio in the day. Let's say you had music. Music was the asset, the property, the IP, the content, right? But if you owned that, you had to distribute it somehow. You had to get it out and had to get people about it. So you needed radio, and radio existed to promote music, and they were symbiotic, right? So you had radio and you had music, and we have Clubhouse and we have podcasts in the same way. That one's the asset, the one's the one you can go and actually consume all the content. But the other one exists purely for airplay. And that's where I see Greenroom and Twitter Spaces and all that come in. It's all about airplay. It's all about discovery, which is a real problem on Spotify and Apple. And bear in mind, the number one discovery platform for podcasts is actually Google search. That's how people find these things, right? So they want to change that. They want people to go to Greenroom to find podcasts rather than Google search.
And I always kind of wonder why Spotify haven't like made an adjustment so that their UI would look more like YouTube. Like, if they had that algorithm homepage, and they were like, these are your episodes of the week that you subscribe to, and these are suggested ones because we follow Graham and Graham is associated with this, so now we're going to push you to this, show this, as in, why isn't that actually there though, if you think about it? Because that would keep me in that element. And that's the stickiness within the app, Well,
I mean, you could ask the same of Apple. It's terrible. Yeah. Apple's UI is just disaster. I mean, but come on, they've had this thing called iTunes for so long, which is like, it looks like AOL back in the day, which is just disaster. Spotify is interesting. It's definitely pushing in the right direction. I can't answer your question about the homepage. I don't know. It would make sense, right? They've tried different things. So they've tried, I know, what's it called? The Daily Mix now, which is like actually a mix of podcasts and music, and they're putting it all together. They're trying a lot of things. So I think they're trying to approach that problem and solve it in a different way to the homepage problem, because maybe people don't go through the homepage. Maybe they're not searching new content like they would do on, say, Google homepage or YouTube. That I don't know. They must know something that most of us don't know about how we're discovering content. But for them, I feel that you look at the issue with audio is that it's unrelated. If you go and consume a podcast, it's very difficult to find something that's actually like it. Right, that's the problem. And one of the problems is because we can't actually access the content inside the audio and tokenize it and turn it into entities and match the fact we're talking about audio with this podcast, with this other podcast, like Lex Friedman and AI, right? Because we're not in the same category. That's a few steps away. And I think once you get to that, you know, a bit like YouTube SoundScan, you know, when they're actually listening, YouTube SoundScans all the new uploads and they actually listen to the content, you know, for closed captions, but they also do it for SEO. So, I mean, Apple and Spotify have been experimenting with this both, effectively sound scanning all your podcasts for keywords. And they can't see any evidence that it's being used currently, but you can bet that it will be used in the next 2 years to help that discovery problem.
They said it was like built into like the metadata in the background or something like that it was possibly running, you know. But this is cool because what's interesting is like, so we don't know the home screen dilemma, and obviously they know something that we don't. But what's cool is that when you're in the wave, like the wave of podcasting or any type of trend, a lot of these things will be figured out over the next couple of years. So if you are in it for the long run, maybe you might get a first mover's advantage. And, you know, anyone that is hearing first mover's advantage with podcasting, you would not think 2021, but definitely how things could change over the next couple of years. You could be an example like this right now. So let the wave kind of carry, you know, which I think is interesting. I'll nearly wrap up on this point, but one of my first podcasts was with a company called WorkVivo. They have a employee engagement app. So basically it's like Facebook for internal employees. And the CEO, who actually was actually in my university, how I met him, he said, I'd prefer to be you could be a poor entrepreneur on a trend and still make it, instead of a great entrepreneur and just working on like on a product that's not in demand and it would just fall to the side. Now, the way he said it was a lot better than the way I said, but it was interesting because, you know, he obviously does work really hard, but he sold his last company and he said that I was quite young at the time, very inexperienced. He caught the trend and then he sold, you know, and he said that now he's all the new learning outcomes and he's trying to like do all these things better. But I thought it was and that was years ago he said it to me, and and I'm kind of stuck with me since. So that's why I apply that kind of logic towards podcasting or things that are coming up at the moment. I don't know. It could have been like working from home, these different elements, you know.
Well, let me give you my own version of that. I graduated with an AI degree in 1995. And like, if I graduated with an AI degree today, I'd be like walking into Google, Facebook, but I went and taught English in Japan. So, you know, that's the point. You could be doing something amazing, but nobody gives a shit about it. Like in AI in 1995, what's that? Nobody knew. Nobody had an idea and could see where it fit in. So, you know, that's absolutely true. But right where we are now with podcasts is that the wave is here. It's happening. And I think by the time all those things that we've talked about, that people are figuring it out, by the time they figured it out, it's too late for people to jump on board and monetize it because everything's priced in. You know, like all the people who are in are now sort of using that knowledge to rise to the top, to game the algorithm, et cetera, et cetera. It's like SEO. Impossible now to rank on page 1 on Google for a common search term. It's too late. The door's closed. And, you know, there was a window of like 6 or 7 years with web and SEO, and people were learning it, figuring it out. You know, all the answers weren't there. It's the same with podcasts. People are figuring it out. 6 or 7 years, closed. Too late. You have to buy. Like if you want to get on page 1 of Google now, you've got to buy a website with traffic, and you've got to spend a lot of money. So to all those people who think, I'll wait until it's figured it out. Well, what does history teach us about that? But then also remember, don't be too early.
Yeah, of course. Otherwise you graduate in 1995 with an AI degree.
For
Graham,
my
I would
sins.
say a massive thank you. Really, really appreciate all the time. This was awesome. And like, I think just for people just to get your kind of knowledge kind of share is just really cool, because like, who am I in this? You know, I'm only 6-7 months into it, but for someone like yourself, you've seen the ups and the downs. So this has been awesome.
Yeah, well, don't say that. I mean, you know, who are you? You're like in the top 5%, right? You've done 50 odd and you're doing it, man. Don't ever underestimate what you've achieved.